Okay, let's dive right into this explainer where we're going to completely break down the unseen world of Islamic theology. Specifically, we'll be focusing on Ruqyah and the all-important surahs used against black magic. We're looking at this really fascinating intersection of theology, spiritual defense, and historical text today. We'll explore what the source material actually says about the very real belief in an invisible world, how malevolent forces from that world can be weaponized through black magic or sihr, and most importantly, the highly structured scriptural countermeasures designed to fight it.
So, the texts on this topic operate on a pretty incredible premise. Humans are not alone in this world. There are unseen forces existing right alongside us. Which brings up a really profound question. How exactly do you wage a defense against an adversary that is literally invisible to the human eye? Well, to understand the answer these texts provide, we first have to understand the battleground itself.
The core concept here is al-ghaib, the unseen realm, and grasping this fundamentally alters how some perceive spiritual and physical threats. According to the sources, this unseen world is populated by beings known as the jinn. Now, just like humans, the texts explain that jinn have free will. They can be good, they can be evil, and they possess their own unique strengths and weaknesses. But the absolute primary rule laid out in the theology is that these two worlds, the human and the jinn, are meant to stay separate. They are absolutely not supposed to cross over into our world.
Part 1. Understanding black magic and pacts in the unseen world. Because what happens when those boundaries between our physical world and the unseen are intentionally and maliciously crossed?
Well, that brings us to the concept of black magic. The sources are super clear here. Black magic, or sihr, is strictly forbidden in Islam. It essentially involves an illegal, polytheistic pact with Satan or malevolent jinn to cause tangible, devastating harm. The texts highlight that a sorcerer commits these illicit acts specifically to gain the dark assistance of these unseen forces. There's a prime example mentioned in the Quran, specifically in Surah Al-Baqarah, which describes magic being used maliciously to sow discord, ruin families, and actually separate a husband and wife. So the sources treat this as a very real, incredibly dangerous phenomenon that can cause immense physical and emotional damage.
But there's a really important nuance in the source material here. While the texts treat magic as an entirely real threat, they also heavily warn that a lot of what people assume is witchcraft or possession is actually just modern anxiety and autosuggestion. The sources caution that when the mere delusion of magic takes hold of someone, their thinking becomes intensely confused. They might suffer physical symptoms like a racing heart, muscle tension, or even convulsions simply due to overwhelming fear and a malfunctioning nervous system. So the texts urge a very careful distinction between a genuine supernatural affliction and a purely psychological delusion that just requires medical attention.
Section 2. The Rules of Ruqyah and the Theological Remedy. So the crucial point is, when a threat is confirmed as genuinely supernatural, what exact theological remedy do you use to fight back? Obviously, you can't use conventional weapons against an unseen enemy.
Enter Ruqyah. This is a formal, strictly rule-based spiritual countermeasure. It is not some chaotic or arbitrary practice. It utilizes specific recitations directly from the Quran along with prophetic supplications. The texts emphasize a massive point here. You cannot fight forbidden magic with more magic. You have to fight it with a highly structured divine remedy.
In fact, Ruqyah is only considered valid if it meets 3 super strict conditions outlined by classical scholars like Ibn Hajar. First, it absolutely must be performed using the words of Allah or His names and attributes. Second, it has to be in clear, intelligible Arabic, so no mysterious mumbo-jumbo allowed. And third, and honestly most importantly, both the practitioner and the patient must firmly believe that the words themselves don't have independent power. The cure comes solely from Allah. These rules ensure the practitioner is relying entirely on divine power.
And this creates a really stark boundary between lawful healing and forbidden magic. The texts explain that unlawful magic often relies on shirk, which means associating partners with God. This manifests in the taboo use of unknown, bizarre words, strange amulets, or actively calling upon unseen entities for help. Valid Ruqyah, on the flip side, is an act of pure monotheism, relying strictly on the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the traditions of the Prophet.
To protect the vulnerable, the texts essentially provide a survival guide for spotting a fake healer or a disguised sorcerer. Think of these as massive red flags. If a supposed healer asks for your mother's name, or demands the blood sacrifice of an animal like a rooster or pigeon, or mutters in incomprehensible languages, or tells you to isolate yourself in a darkened room for days, run. The sources flag these as the literal hallmarks of illicit pacts with the jinn, not valid ruqyah.
Part 3. The ultimate protection. Verses. The arsenal against Ser. Okay, let's get into the actual tools. When we talk about Ruqyah, we are talking specifically about the verses and chapters from the Quran utilized to combat these dark arts. This is where we get into those all-important surahs.
What's absolutely fascinating here is how specific surahs are tactically mapped to neutralize distinct unseen threats. It's almost like a spiritual defensive playbook. Surah al-Falaq and Surah an-Nas, known together as the Mu'awwidatayn, or the two protecting ones, are the primary means to repel witchcraft. And then you have Ayatul Kursi, which serves a very specific, heavy-duty defensive purpose.
For instance, let's take a closer look at Surah al-Falaq. It directly names the blowers and knots. The texts identify this as a direct counter to the physical mechanics of binding spells used by witches. Historical and textual sources point out that magicians would literally take a piece of string, tie physical knots into it, and blow onto those knots to cast a binding spell. Reciting this specific surah is viewed as the precise surgical antidote to shatter that exact type of localized magic.
And then there's Ayatul Kursi, the throne verse. This is widely regarded across Orthodox texts and even esoteric grimoires as the absolute, unparalleled shield against any demonic presence. The sources actually recount an incredible story about a companion named Ubay bin Ka'b. He was guarding his harvest of dates when he encountered this bizarre, shape-shifting jinn trying to steal them. When Ubay directly asked the entity what could actually protect humans from them, the jinn itself admitted that Ayatul Kursi was the ultimate protection, a fact that the prophet later confirmed.
However, the sources also highlight a much darker historical reality. While Orthodox Ruqyah uses these verses purely to seek refuge and protection from God, historical grimoires, like the infamous Shams al-Ma'arif, actually misappropriated these exact same verses. Instead of using them for protection, occultists used them to illicitly summon, bind, and command unseen spirits, flipping the scriptural purpose completely on its head.
For example, occult traditions heavily relied on what we can basically call the Solomon paradigm. They would quote Prophet Solomon's exact words found in Surah An-Nam to try and force unseen entities into submission, essentially commanding them to come to me in submission just as Solomon historically did. Mainstream Islamic theology heavily condemns this, reinforcing that humans today do not have Solomon's unique dominion over the jinn. Attempting to do so is a massive, dangerous foray into forbidden magic.
Section 4. The Sword and the Wielder. Completing the defense. Because here is the crucial point. Simply having access to these powerful verses or knowing exactly which surah to read isn't enough to guarantee protection. The words themselves? They're only half of the equation.
The classical scholar Ibn al-Qayyim summarizes this with a truly brilliant analogy. He states that Ruqyah should be viewed like a sword. A sword can be incredibly sharp, just as the verses of the Quran are spiritually powerful, but that sharpness is of absolutely no use if the arm swinging it is weak. The person performing the Ruqyah has to possess strong faith, absolute sincerity, and experience for that sword to actually cut through the spiritual threat.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty heavy thought to ponder from the source material today. The texts lay out a comprehensive system of unseen threats and a really specific arsenal of scriptural defenses. But ultimately, the effectiveness of Ruqyah comes down to the inner state of the believer. If the theological tools to fight the unseen are readily available, how prepared is the individual to actually wield them? It really comes down to a question of faith over formula. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this provided some clarity into the complex theology of Ruqyah and the unseen world.